Hello, friends, and welcome to The Membership, a podcast about the works and life of Wendell Berry, the farmer, poet, novelist, essayist, activist, and thinker. My name is Jason Hardy, and today in this interview episode, I'm joined in person by my usual co-host and fellow member, John Pattison, as well as our guest and fellow member, Charlie Peacock. Charlie Peacock is a Nashville-based 4 times Grammy Award-winning multi-format jazz and pop recording artist, composer, and record producer. Peacock's production credits range from Chris Cornell and Ladysmith Black Mambazo to AAA and Americana successes such as The Lone Bellow, Holly Williams, The Civil Wars, Ben Rector, and Brett Dennen. Peacock began his iconoclastic career in the 1980s as a singer-songwriter for Exit A&M, then Island Records. In addition to his unique solo efforts, Peacock has played a lead role in creating major chart hits in 3 separate decades, most notably Amy Grant's Every Heartbeat in 1991, Switchfoot's Dare You to Move in 2002, the Civil War's gold debut album Barton Hollow in 2011, earning Grammys for Best Folk Album and Country Duo, and the 2013 #1 Billboard pop debut, The Civil Wars, featuring the co-written single, The One That Got Away. In recent years, Peacock's solo output has included his acclaimed singer-songwriter release No Man's Land from 2012, and 4 jazz improvisational releases, including 2018's When Light Flashes, Help Is on the Way, which includes the track titled Wendell Berry in the Fields at Night. As evidenced by that track, Charlie is also a fan of Wendell Berry, and we're thrilled he agreed to join us on today's episode to talk through what Wendell Berry has meant to him and his work. Charlie, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, of course.
Well, one of the questions that we're asking all of our guests is for them to describe their Wendell Berry origin story, so to speak. When did you first encounter Wendell Berry's work?
Yeah, I first encountered Wendell Berry's work when we moved from California to Nashville. And that was my first interaction with the concept of a Southern agrarian.
Mm-hmm.
And, of course, I grew up in a farm community, as I was telling you guys earlier. And so agrarian communities were common to my growing up. But I'd never heard the term Southern agrarian. And I especially had never heard the term Southern agrarian and intellectual in the same sentence. So I became very inquisitive and wanted to find out about who these characters might be. And of course, just a cursory look is going to lead you to Wendell Berry immediately. I read essays first before I read any fiction or poetry. And I still go to the essays probably most, although I guess I'd probably say that every person should read Hannah Coulter every 5 years or so, just to recenter yourself.
Mm-hmm. And was there a particular collection that you started with?
Yes, I did. I brought out a couple. We own, I think, pretty much every book that Wendell Berry's put out, but I believe it was The Way of Ignorance, this group of essays that I started with. I was also loved the citizenship papers quite a bit, particularly in the time when the book came out. Sex, Economy, Freedom, and Community is another important collection of essays for me.
What did you find yourself resonating with as you first began interacting with his writing?
Well, I'd have to take you back a little bit further before Andy and I moved to Nashville, if that's okay.
Sure, absolutely.
Yeah.
We got together when we were 14 and 15 years old. So we've been married for 43 years. And during that time, in the early 1970s, there were some characters in California that were very important to that time. Our governor at the time, a young man named Jerry Brown, and he gathered around him a bunch of counterculture characters who held positions in his cabinet and government and whatnot. And a fellow by the name of Gary Snyder became a part of the Arts and Humanities Council. And I knew Gary Snyder from when I was 15. I started reading Jack Kerouac. And of course, his name is Jaffe Ryder in the Dharma Bums. But once I found out about Gary Snyder, I read everything that he wrote, and he had a Pulitzer Prize-winning book of poetry in 1974 or 5 called Turtle Island. So I tell you that story just to say that I was completely primed to encounter Wendell Berry via Gary Snyder. And of course, you guys, as you're studying Wendell, you know that there's a book of published letters between Wendell and Gary. So it was kind of like fast forward all these years. It's like, well, of course they knew each other, you know. Well, when I had just graduated from high school as a junior, one of the first things I did when I went to the junior college that was in our neighborhood, and I was just 17 years old, but a social studies teacher in our high school knew Gary Snyder, just tangentially. And so through him, I got Gary's address up on San Juan Hill, and just outside of Nevada City. And I wrote to him and invited him to come and speak at Yuba College. Okay? And he did. He brought a whole caravan of counterculture tribalists. And so that was just kind of, for me, Gary Snyder was, I loved Miles Davis. Miles Davis opened me up to musical experimentation like no one else, but he was not necessarily a person to admire. John Coltrane showed me that you could have the biggest album of your career that was completely explicit in its adoration of God, seeking transcendence through music. Jack Kerouac told me that if you don't want to do something, then don't do it. Which was, for a 15-year-old, that was a revolutionary message. Dream another dream. You don't need to be stuck in this sort of cookie-cutter suburban life. But Gary Snyder, above all the others, he was the one who showed me that you could be a poet, you could be a man's man, you could be a person of the land, you could understand agriculture, conservationism, what was then called ecology. You could dream big dreams. You could do things in a counterculture way. You didn't have to live just like everybody lived. So he was really the one that kind of gave me an ethical, moral basis on which to begin. And out of that, and then I encountered the person of Jesus and that whole story, and I entered into that story. But all those characters before are very, very important, right? And Gary Snyder is super important. So now you move to Wendell Berry, right? Well, now you get a guy who has all the things that Gary Snyder's got going on, and he has a profession of Christ is who he says he is, right? So that's why Wendell is so much of a home base for me.
Yeah.
Language of the home base, yeah.
That's great. Well, I'm wondering then, how has Wendell Berry's thought, maybe from his essays, how has that influenced the way that you do your work as a musician, as a composer, as a producer?
Yeah. Well, I think the whole concept of neighborliness and place are very, very embedded into what I do. So I never do anything creatively that is a great distance away from my immediate experiences with people. Doesn't mean that I'm not going to dream up something or imagine something that might kind of come from left field. But at its heart, I'm going to do it for the love of people. I'm going to do it for the love of place. And so as I grew as a musician and I had opportunity, my work created other opportunities for me as people celebrated what it was that I was making musically. That allowed me to create a place through the art house, almost 30 years ago now. Because I wanted to have a place of gathering. So the whole concept of God, people, and place, which is at the foundation of Barry's philosophy and theology, is very much about what Andy and I are about. And when we began the art house work, it was very much about that. What does it mean to be in community with people? And what does it mean to create the place where people gather so that there's a notion of when we come here, we expect good to happen. And that's a very much a very Wendell idea of like, you can't say that, like he had said, you can't say that America is a good country, if it's not good.
Right.
Just because it does all of these things that are expedient, or it does things that make money, or so on and so forth. You've always got to be asking the question, yes, but is it good? By forget the world standards of good. Just how about you personally? Is it good for you and your family and your neighbors? And I think the great thing about Wendell and agriculture is that you can extrapolate outward from all of that metaphorically to the whole of life. And that's another reason why it rings my bell, because again, I come from a farm community.
Yeah.
So when I think about record production, I know how to delay gratification, right? Because that's embedded in farm people,
Wow.
right? You plant, right? You tend, you water, you care for something, and you're hoping for good fruit, right? But nothing's going to happen overnight, right? And it may require a lot of adaptivity to you. Like where I'm from, it's big peach farming, right? So for 100 years, pomologists have been working with peach trees, right, and changing out rootstocks and figuring out how can we get the most robust rootstock, the smallest, most compact tree that needs the least amount of water to produce the maximum amount of fruit, that the branches don't break, right? All of that takes time. And so for me as an artist, that's why I've never been run by the clock. I've always been run by the notion of, is it good?
Yeah. So what does that look like on a recording session when you're working on a record? What does that look like to you when it plays itself out?
Well, I think you can grieve failure, but just like you would on the farm, you got to get right to problem solving. You can say, oh my gosh, that levee broke, or that check broke, and all our irrigation just escaped, down the side of the hill, right? But then it's like, now you got to fix the check, you got to fix the levee, right? And do what it takes, right? And it's the same in record production. You make a series of choices, you assess those choices, some succeed, others don't. Those that don't succeed, you look at them again, you try to determine, is this something worth fixing for the greater good? This song, this production, this artist's career, etc. And you're just constantly weighing the goodness of ideas and how much it relates to the people and to the place and to, in my case, when I'm working with fellow Christians, what it means to profess to be a follower of Jesus. So that's an integrated, seamless way of looking at all vocation.
Yeah, that's great. Well, I mean, you mentioned place, and that is absolutely something that is central to Wendell Berry's thought. You know, for him as a writer, that meant sort of taking his place as the subject that he was going to write about.
Yeah.
What does that mean for you in music? How can music be focused on a place?
Yeah. Well, music's very interesting in terms of place. It's because there's no neutrality, of course, about where you're born. And the era that you're born, the place that you're born. For example, I was born in Northern California. Okay, I was born in 1956. If you were to look at the year 1956 in the history of rock and roll, your mind would be blown.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, so in the year that I was born, one iconic record after another came out, all right, which gave birth to the 1960s, right, which gave birth to iconic music that still lives today. Well, in Northern California played its own little role, all right, and particularly in the Bay Area. And so it wasn't, you know, it was like a stone's throw down the road, you know, a 2-hour drive to everything that was happening in Haight-Ashbury, everything that was happening with the Grateful Dead, the Jefferson Airplane, in the Oakland side, the Bay Area horn bands like Cold Blood and Tower of Power, and all the jazz that was happening in the city. So even though I lived in a farm town, you know, I had older kids who hit me to how to tune into KPFA in Berkeley and you know, and where to buy Rolling Stone and kind of get hip to what was happening in the Bay Area. So by the time, before I was 21 years old, I mean, I had seen and heard so many amazing artists live, from, you know, little known but sort of iconic Bay Area bands like Blue Cheer or Moby Grape, you know, which are just like footnotes in rock history, to Stan Getz Quartet, Bill Evans, Ray Charles, Ike and Tina Turner. You know, the list just goes on. I mean, of the amount of music that I heard and saw live before I was 21 years old. Okay,
Yeah.
so that's the power of place.
Mm-hmm.
So in many ways, if somebody were to ask me, well, how did you become a record producer? You know, there's a part of it is, well, how could I not?
Sure, because of the place
Yeah,
where...
if I had the other necessary ingredients, a part of my makeup, then how could I not?
Right.
I mean, I was living inside of a history lesson.
Wendell Berry has a poem called "The Man Born to Farming." In your case, it would be "The Man Born to Music" or "The Man Born to
the
Record
man
Producing."
born to music. And also, you know, music for me was my way out of the farm towns. That's the irony of it, you know, because I had to go back much later as an adult, you know, in my mid-40s and early 50s, and go back there. I bought a house in Yuba City, and we had kept a house there for about 6 years. And during that time, I reacquainted myself with everything about where I grew up.
Wow.
So that I would have an appreciation. Because when I left there, in my mind, this is a place you leave.
Yeah.
Okay? And it was. To do what I've done in music, it was a place you leave.
Sure.
But what you wouldn't want to do when you have to leave a place in order to fulfill your vocation you don't want to dismiss the place from
Mm.
which you were born and where you come and who your people are. So I needed to go back there and see, oh, that's why I'm like this. That's why this is important. That's where I got this. And I got it in a little farm town, with a modest family of modest roots, people who worked really hard.
Mm-hmm.
And, my generation, I was the second generation Californian. My dad was just barely born in Orville, California. My mom was born in Durant, Oklahoma. But the rest of the family came from, Singer, Louisiana, and came from Durant, Oklahoma. And they came because there was no more life for them there.
Wow.
They left that place. Well, since then, I've even gone back to the place in Louisiana,
Oh, wow.
right, to touch that ground and to walk that ground, to see, where my grandmother lived as a little girl, where my great-grandfather's property was, and just even as a matter of an homage to everyone who came before me, even though no one uses that property and haven't for decades and decades, 7 decades at least, I pay the taxes on it
Oh, wow.
because it connects me to that place.
Mm.
So we'll always be in Nashville. We'll spend the rest of our life here in Nashville. Nashville is our place,
Mm-hmm.
right? But I'll never forget growing up in Northern California and Yuba City. And now I won't forget going back to Louisiana and seeing the place where the musical part of my family came from.
You've been described as, or maybe this was even something you said about your own music, that it's music that's rooted in America, and you're pulling, as you just said, not just from Northern California, not just from Nashville, but from Louisiana is another example that you gave,
Right.
both here and in something that I read for you. So
Yeah, very much so. I mean, I can write every kind of music that there is. And so when you think of in terms of American music, I could write in an Aaron Copland style. I could write in a Carl Schreiber kind of cartoonesque, style from the cartoons that I grew up with. In fact, there's a record called Arc of the Circle that I did with Jeff Coffin that you can kind of hear me playing and teasing out some of those ideas on that. And then, of course, blues. Blues were, every kid in Northern California learned to play the blues first because we had Oakland and San Francisco. And blues were very important to the Bay Area. And then, of course, rock. I mean, huge rock explosion of the 60s. Jazz, I'm adept at playing jazz. My grandfather sang Okie migrant songs my whole life. That's very much a part of me, like a Bob Wills kind of, piece. My uncle was a huge country, then when it was country and western, and I listened to a lot of Ferland Husky and other old timers, Merle Haggard. It's very much a part of me. And then the piece that I can't grasp, it's more like ether, but it's the Louisiana piece, right? Because it's like the painting that I showed you guys of my great Uncle Tommy, playing a resonator guitar. And when I grew up, I only knew Uncle Tommy as this bent over sort of scary creature that looked like he came from the Civil War, right? But every time we would visit, my Uncle Bo would give each of us Chiclets gum, and then Tommy would get out his fiddle, and he was bent over, and he played in the open position, like hillbillies do, right? So it's not up under your chin, it's just right here on your arm.
Yep.
You sort of saw away at it, and he would play for us every time. So I was able in my childhood to have all of that, exposed to me. My dad was trying to be sophisticated, right? So he's playing Oscar Peterson and Tony Bennett and Bill Evans and Miles Davis, right? So it all blends together. And then if you look at everything that I've done, it's all right there. I mean, there's nothing hidden. The clues are very obvious.
Yeah, I think we were talking a little bit before we started recording about your latest album, when Light Flashes, Help Is on the Way, and I think I can definitely hear lots of those things on that album. I mean, it's a jazz album, instrumental jazz album, but you've got elements of there's accordion on several tracks, fiddle, and a lot of those things sort of bleeding in there.
Yeah, I think, and part of that is because I'm not a genre-specific artist, and again, the place that I grew up in celebrated eclecticism, and that's what I am.
Wow, yeah.
So, in many ways, I'm shaped and formed to not be compliant. When you look at the indoctrination of Kerouac and then the celebration of eclecticism, and then you can even go back to when I wrote the book about Christian music, right? And my number one thesis was that genre is too small to hold what God's musical people do. Right?
Wow. It reminds me of the Mad Farmer Manifesto, where Wendell Berry says, as soon as the generals and the politicos can predict the motions of your mind, lose it. Leave it as
the false trail.
Yeah, leave it as the false trail, the way you didn't go.
Yeah.
Be like the fox who makes more tracks than necessary, some in the wrong direction.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, I love that.
Yeah.
Well, speaking of the newest album, the title track is not title track. The first track is Wendell Berry's "In the Fields at Night," and I'm wondering if you could talk about that particular piece and why you chose maybe the origin of it and how you chose the title.
Yeah. Well, I often when I'm titling instrumental music is that I'll just close my eyes and listen to it, and I'll get superficial impressions immediately, and then I'll try to see if there's something deeper than that, and just kind of sit with it for a bit, and then the poeticism of the title is very important to me, the musicality of the title. So I'll spend a good bit of time titling my instrumental music. I think one of the things that when I really came and landed on Wendell Berry in the Fields at Night, I, more than anything, just wanted people to listen to that music and say, who is Wendell Berry?
It was a gateway.
Yeah, it was a gateway drug.
Yeah.
I wanted them to wonder, I knew that there would be, people like you fellows who would know who it was. But if they didn't, I hope that they would be curious, because I feel like Wendell is an antidote, he's medicine. And particularly in the time that we live now, I mean, he's never sounded more sane. And so just to sort of give a little sign and signal in that way. And then the image of it, of that the farmer, the one who tends place, spends a whole day doing that work, right? and then gathers together with family and has the supper, has the dinner meal, right? And there's a moment where maybe you have to take one more look at what you did that day, you know, and maybe you step out the screen door to the back of the house or the front of the house, and you walk a bit, you know, and you smell the way the night smells, and you just look over your place, and maybe you say a prayer, maybe you give thanks, but there's just that sense of like, day and night I steward this.
Yeah, that's great. I think this track might be the funkiest thing associated with Wendell-Berry.
I hope so.
Yeah.
I hope so.
Yeah.
I mean, if someone ever plays it for Wendell, I hope he's not offended by it.
Oh, I'm sure he wouldn't be. What about the musical elements of that track might be evocative of Wendell-Berry? You've got kind of that doubled melody on lots of different kinds of instruments, like the sax, the mandolin. It sounds like an accordion.
Yeah. I think it's a riff, right?
Yeah.
And the one thing we know about Wendell is he's easy to riff on.
Yeah, we're gonna do it for 6 or 7 years with this podcast.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, because you can take one idea, and you can riff on it.
Yeah.
And that's what he does in his essays. He can take this kernel of an idea and extrapolate outward from it. That's why I say, like, let's, for example, let's say you've got a backhoe and you're scraping the topsoil off in your backyard, right? And you scrape it all off, right? 8 inches of topsoil you scrape off, right? Because you're trying to get rid of junk and weeds and whatnot. That's just a simple act, right? That a man or a woman could do, thinking they're cleaning their backyard, right? That act, which might take up no more than 100, 200, 300 square feet, right? It may take decades to get that backyard to the place where it would grow things naturally in a fruitful way. Right? So Wendell can take an idea like that, right? And at the end of it, you know he's talking about a farm. You know he's talking about the inner landscape of your soul. And you know he's talking about the whole of the planet Earth.
Yeah, that's great.
The poem that came to mind as I was listening to it, one of the times I was listening to it, was a poem that we had just talked about in a recent episode from the collection Openings, and he talks in there about a kingfisher whose flight can only be understood as a flight done just for the sake of pure joy.
Yeah.
And that came to mind as I was listening to that track.
Good.
Just
Well,
the joy.
I'm glad it is a joyful sound.
Well, so yeah, and you work with some pretty amazing collaborators on this album. How did that group come together? Have you worked with most of them previously?
Well, why don't you gentlemen remind me of who was on there?
Well, the one that stood out to me was as someone who is an amateur bass player is Felix Pastorius.
Yes.
The son
Yes.
of, obviously the son of
Jocko.
Jocko, yeah.
Since James Jamerson and
Yeah.
others, the most innovative electric bassist in the 20th century.
Yeah.
Yes, met Felix through our mutual friend Jeff Coffin, the musician and tenor saxophonist with Dave Matthews Band, and we became friends and did a gig together and then did a recording session together in Brooklyn.
Yeah.
And have spent a little bit of time together, but fantastic musician. I don't know if you've ever seen him play or not, but
I've watched
but
a few videos of him play.
he probably has the biggest hands of any bass player I've ever encountered. So he there was the thought that he might play basketball instead of music, because apparently he was quite a good basketball player too.
Sure.
But I could see that, yeah. I could see him carrying the ball down with one hand easily.
Yeah. Yeah, it was great. Like the first time I listened through the record, I was listening to the bass, and because I pay a lot of attention to that, I was like, oh, that kind of sounds like Jocko, and then I read up on it a little bit, like, oh,
Yeah.
that's his son playing.
Yeah, he doesn't, and to his credit, he doesn't just totally knock off his dad.
Sure.
He definitely does some things that are unique to himself, but in many ways, he's a little bit more like Marcus Miller. So he's kind of a combination, I think, of Marcus Miller and his dad and his own thing.
Yeah, that's great. Well, I think there was one other track on that record that really stood out to us as
Yeah, and that was the final track, Gift Economy.
Yes.
To me, the title was very evocative of Wendell Berry,
Oh yeah, it's very Wendell Berry.
who writes about one of his essays, The Two Economies,
Mm-hmm.
writes about sort of the traditional economies of the world and what he calls the great economy,
Yeah.
which is, he says very explicitly, is for him a way of talking about the kingdom of God.
Yes.
It also reminded me of a book by Lewis Hyde called The Gift.
Mhm.
And Lewis Hyde talks about how artistic practices don't fit well into the traditional marketplace.
Right.
And then it reminded me too of Wendell Berry's Sabbath poems. And so lots of things were coming up for me just from the title, and then as I ruminated on the title as I was listening to the music. And so,
Yeah.
maybe in the, at the risk of being redundant, can you talk about sort of the origin of that song and then how you titled that? Like, what were you thinking?
Well, one of the reasons why it has the word gift in it is because it was a song that had several incarnations.
Mhm.
It's sort of a bit like the painting downstairs that we were looking at. Many layers to it, and then sort of sorting it out, and the kind of the last thing that pulled it all together was the drummer Jordan Pearlson, who played on it, and then that kind of set everything right for me. Prior to that, I was having difficulty making the track work, but as soon as Jordan did his thing, then everything came kind of glued together, and then I knew what to do with the track. Because, just for the listeners, I mean, a lot of jazz records are recorded in 2 or 3 days, where you go in and you do 3 takes of each song, and then somebody sits and edits them, and they're just kind of that pure representation of it. Those are not the kinds of records that I make. I capture performances, right? But I still use my pop production chops, right, to dream other dreams for the source material. Okay, so it may come in one way in a performance, but I may manipulate it to send it in another direction. So I had done a lot of manipulation on that song and additional composition on it. And so the fact, then once it came together, I didn't have a title yet. Then I was like, this is a gift. Right? So and then I remembered, yes, it's gift economy. Yeah, it's not transactional. There's mystery to it.
Yes.
It's relational. And I think that when I think of the gift economy, I think of everyone living in a good and beautiful activation of their vocations,
Yes.
giving to one another, receiving from one another, less in a transactional sense and more in a relational sense of there's something good I want to give you. There's something good I want to receive. And I just think, you can still make money and do really well and have that at the heart of what you do. And I know that's what I've tried to do with my life is I find no fault with succeeding at things by the world standards of success. I think it's foolish to not try to succeed at them. But as my friend John Foreman has quoted me saying, people over projects.
There's a part of a Sabbath poem that I'd like to read. Are you familiar with Wendell Berry's Sabbath poems? Yeah. This one's from 1998, and this is just an excerpt from the 6th poem from that year. He says, "Nothing is given that is not taken, and nothing taken that was not first a gift. The gift is balanced by its total loss, and yet the light breaks in, heaven seizing its moments that are at once its own and yours. The day ends and is unending, where the summer tanager and vireos sing as they move among illuminated leaves." I'm just hoping maybe you could talk a bit about how you think about your own artistic gifts as it relates to being a person of faith, and exercising those gifts in your vocation, as you were saying, as a musician and producer. How do you think about that, and just in terms of the gifts that God has given you?
Yeah. Well, I gave you guys a little introduction in the beginning, and so my earliest teachers like Miles Davis or Jack Kerouac, the gift was all about self. It was all about bringing everything unto yourself. Kerouac had a little more community, a little more tribe. But the gift was always about something other than the gift. It always had attachments, right? The attachments might be sex, they might be drugs, they might be thrills, they might be travel, some kind of, I'm going to do this thing, and it's going to get me the ability to do this thing, right? Which is still a transactional way of looking at gifts. And I lived that way, up until I was almost 25 years old, at least. And when I encountered the teachings of Christ and the New Testament, the Bible, it turned all of that upside down for me. If I wanted to find my life, I was going to have to lose it. And if I wanted to be rich, I was going to have to give it all away. And everything was a paradox, and that rocked my world and realigned me back to what I know now is God's desire for humanity. It is the kingdom come and the kingdom coming to be a different kind of person in the world. They actually be one kind of person in the world and not another. And that one kind of person is someone who is who has a compass. No matter how great their failures, they have a compass that seeks to love God and neighbor. I mean, you could be the biggest screw up in the world, but if your compass is still pointed towards God and neighbor, you're going to live to tell another day.
Yeah.
That's how big grace is. And so that was how my world view shifted. That's how everything about what I did musically changed. Not the making of it. I made some of my most innovative music like right at the time when I was just coming to Christ, when I was just seeking God and praying to the God of the Bible, which I had done for a year prior to actually having an encounter with Christ. I would get up every morning and at night I would pray to the God of the Bible. And then somebody came and a year later introduced me to the God of the Bible. I didn't expect, that there would be such an overnight shift, right? But I guess I had enough of that early artistic training through those early influences that I didn't just sort of flip completely away from what I knew about being an artist. But I immediately asked the questions. Like, for example, I had a very popular band, and we would get 100% of the door and 10% of the bar, okay, which was unheard of. Right?
Yeah.
So, we'd have 200 people lined up outside to get in, and that was a good night, as a young musician playing your own music. So the first thing that I did, I was immediately convicted that to take profanity out of my lyrics. I had a couple of songs that used the F word, and I just thought, you know what? Swearing has been a way to hurt people. It has been a way to overemphasize something for your own self, glorification, getting your own way. And that word, I've used that word in so many ways like that. I'm gonna take that word out of my vocabulary and not use that, and take it out of my songs. And then the other thing is like, I know people come to hear me to hear the music, but they come to pick each other up. They come to buy cocaine from the guy who always brings the cocaine. They come to get wasted. Some people just come to have a good time. People are coming for all different reasons. But I don't want to profit off the bar. So I gave up the 10% of the bar. And I risked belief in God by charging more at the door. By saying, if this is where I'm supposed to be, what I'm supposed to be doing right now, then we were used to getting this money, so I'm going to, on faith, charge more. So it was like that simple of choices that I was making in the beginning.
Mm-hmm.
They were practical to my everyday life, you know.
Yeah.
And then of course, you know, the nuance of it now, you know, 35 years later it's quite different. You know, I'm not praying for a parking space anymore, but though I probably should.
Yeah, Nashville as it is now.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's great. Wonder if you might update our listeners on what you're working on now.
Sure,
what you
sure.
got coming down the pike.
Yeah, I would tell your listeners that I'm busy making music, and they can find a lot of that new music on Instagram or on Facebook, because I'm a composer for Facebook and Instagram. So you can, at the bottom of your page on your mobile device, there's a music selection, and you can click that, and you're going to send something to somebody, you want to have a little music on it, you know. Just search there, you'll see, you know, everybody from Bruno Mars to me. And I've created a bunch of new music for that too. There's a lot of jazz on there. So that's where you can find new music. I just finished a new single for Sarah Mason, who's a fantastic artist that I signed 20 years ago. And that single will come out next week. And doing a lot of painting, as you guys saw.
Yeah.
Andy and I, we remain, you know, the co-founders and founders emeritus of the Art House. There's 3 branches, one in Dallas here in town, and one in St. Paul, Minnesota. And then Andy and I are about to reveal a new mutual blog together called The Writer and the Husband. So that'll be coming up in the next few months. We're hoping by 1st of March now, I think, to have that done. And then the next new music release that I'll have will be a second solo piano album.
Okay.
So anybody who enjoyed Lemonade, you'll get Lemonade Part 2.
Nice. That's great. Well, where can our listeners find you online?
CharliePeacock.com and TheWriterandTheHusband.com and ArthouseAmerica.com. There's probably 20 essays on there that they can read at ArthouseAmerica.com, as well as Andy's essays.
Great.
And then, you know, I mean, I'm on all the social media stuff.
Sure.
And we'll provide links for the listeners in the show notes.
Yeah.
Follow along with what you're doing.
Yeah. Thank you so much for having me on.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for taking the time.
It's
We
great.
really-
I love that you guys are evangelists for Wendell, and I join with you. I lock arms with you and telling his story. I think, you know, he's such a man of humility. He's like the last person that would toot his own horn.
Sure.
But I think the 3 of us can agree we're happy to toot it for him.
Yes.
Yes,
Exactly.
absolutely.
All right, thanks, guys.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to this special interview episode of The Membership. We'd like to thank our guest, Charlie Peacock, for welcoming us into his home and for agreeing to do this interview. He also graciously let us use clips from his 2018 album, When Light Flashes, Help is on the Way. The excerpt from the Sabbath poem we read is from This Day, Collected and New Sabbath Poems by Wendell Berry. Copyright Counterpoint Press 2014. You can find our show notes for this episode, as well as an updated reading list for future episodes, on our website at membershippod.com. We're also on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram, all at membershippod. The Membership is a proud member of the Rabbit Room Podcast Network. To discover more great podcasts and to learn about sponsorship opportunities, go to rabbitroom.org/podcasts. Finally, we'd like to ask a favor. If you're enjoying this podcast, would you head over to iTunes and leave a review or rating? We already have 48 5-star ratings, which is very encouraging. Thank you for all of your support, and thanks for listening.